Just one quick note, our Monday evening adult Bible discussion time will be starting a week from tomorrow. We're going to be returning. That's how people feel when they can't hear me preach, right? And we're going to be returning to our topic of things to come, our studying the book of the Revelation. We're kind of like halfway through that. So if you haven't been a part of it, please come and join us. But it will be starting a week from tomorrow. I was just informed today that our parking lot is being done tomorrow. So that actually works out kind of good. I didn't plan it like this, but of course, the Lord's always got a bigger plan than that. So our parking lot will be under construction, as it were, for at least a day. So a week from tomorrow at 6:30, we'll start our Things to Come Bible study again. We're going to be using most of our time over the next couple of seasons here. By that I mean, going into the fall and into the winter. And we're going to be springboarding off of our look that we've had in the last couple of weeks on postmodernism. We're going to be going into a topic that we're calling In the Beginning. It's not necessarily an original topic, I didn't think that up, but it fits and I like it. And Genesis is going to be our text. It's going to be our teacher. And in it all, we're going to see this collision between heaven and earth as it battles for the minds of men. Two different worldviews will battle for the control of planet Earth. It's the kind of battle that will lead to many other things and other dangerous ways to look at the world, like we saw in the last couple of weeks by looking at postmodernism. To win this battle, originally, when it first started, it was left in the control of the two best people who ever walked this planet, outside of the person of Jesus Christ, that is. The prize was everything. On the surface, the winner would win everything, and the loser would lose everything. The stakes will never be higher. In fact, the only time the stakes, when this battle first started, the only time the stakes are ever matched by this is when the battle for the mind and the will takes place every time a person gets saved. But no battle is greater than this. Now we're talking about, obviously, the garden, talking about the person of Adam and Eve. A perfect world created in the beginning. That will be our series here in a couple weeks, in the beginning. And it's interesting because in that perfect world, it's where you would not expect conflict to be. Heaven and earth collide for the very first time ever. Man versus Satan. And we lost on the surface. On the surface, we lost. And by that I mean heaven was lost. And we as a people created in God's image, we lost everything. And now all kinds of things that never were originally intended by God would ravage our planet, has continued to ravage our planet. Well, we're going to spend a couple of weeks introducing our overview of Genesis here. We're going to look at some passages through word and verse study, and we are going to be taking our time around the Lord's table here this morning. But our overall purpose as we get into Genesis is just going to be by way of an overview, even though we'll take some time and look at some things intricately as well. But in this unleashing of these dark forces of sin, we also know, we're going to learn more of, that God had other things happening. He unveiled an even greater plan than what his original one was all about. But for the moment, what I want to do is I want us to see how this darker side still plagues us. Still plagues us since the time of the garden for the last 6,000 plus years. Yes, I am an earth creationist. I do believe that's what the Bible portrays to us. But I'm just saying, since from the time of Adam, we are still plagued by these things. And let me kind of introduce it like this. Some years ago at a youth group meeting, we had a question and answer period. We would do this from time to time with this youth group. We just felt that it kind of gave the kids, the young people there, a chance to kind of vent, just to speak about whatever it was that was most important to them at that moment, maybe something that's been happening in their lives recently or whatever. And we're getting all kinds of questions, but one young guy raises his hand and he asks the question, why do people murder? Interesting. Why do people murder? Where does it come from? That's what he wanted to know. Where does it come from? Well, I thought it was a good question, so I turned the question over to the group before I said anything. I just kind of wanted to see how all these young people would think about the same kind of thing. That way you kind of get an idea of what they might be thinking. I mean, obviously it's a serious question, serious problem in our world. I wasn't quite sure of the feedback. I was a little bit leery that this wasn't going to kind of get picked up on by the group, but I was wrong. Got all kinds of responses. Some of them said, well, I think murder comes from anger. Okay, yeah, that's a good response. Explain that. What do you think you mean by that? Someone else said, I think murder comes from pride. Okay, that's a good response to explain that to me. We got responses like jealousy and wanting something that somebody else had. See, at that time, there was almost kind of like an epidemic. I don't know if this epidemic is still going on. It's just not reported anymore. But at that time, there was an epidemic of kids killing kids for their gym shoes, for their $200 and $300 gym shoes. I mean, kids in the ghettos were wearing $300 gym shoes, and they'd be shot down, and their shoes would be taken. The money wouldn't be taken, the shoes would be taken. So I don't know if that's what prompted this question here, but it's a good response. Some said desperation. Some murder because of fear, even some attempted explanation that people have a brain defect. You know, there's some kind of mental illness going on. In fact, that's an argument we still use today with our control issues that come up. Well, when I was listening to all of these, I decided what I wanted to do is take them down a different path. I wanted to take them down the path that murder, as serious as the crime is really a conflict of worldviews. It is a question of worldviews. It's one of the most serious ways, though it's certainly not the only way, that forces us to see this collision that takes place between heaven and earth. And of course, as I was telling this to them, I was getting some blank stares because they hadn't considered it that way, so I wanted to expand on that, kind of the way I want to expand on that this morning. I said, I want you to consider, would you agree with me or not? And I can kind of ask you the same question. Would you agree with me that no rational person, and I emphasize the word rational, would you agree that no rational person condones murder for murder's sake? Would you agree with that? Well, in this group, sure enough, they did. Yeah, no rational person just condones murder for the sake of killing somebody. But here's the thing, I said. All you got to do with that is just change a few circumstances. Use different terms. Alter the definitions just slightly. Most of all, include in that our own personal journeys of life's difficulties. And all of a sudden, what we have, what we once called murder one day, now isn't. Even for the rational person. With all the variables now added in, think about things like abortion, euthanasia, infanticide, mercy killings. We talk about, delving into a person's DNA and what kind of mental illness. I mentioned that already. All of this, you include this in, now seeks to call this something else. You no longer have a crime, legal or moral. There's an issue going on right now in the state of Idaho. In their prison system, there's a prisoner there. He's serving a life sentence because he raped and murdered a child. And now he's demanding a sex change operation. And of course, prison officials initially said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not here for that purpose. And so he sued, and the federal judge agreed with the prison system. So he appealed it and went to the Ninth Circuit Court. The Ninth Circuit Court, if you know anything about this, is a very liberal court. And of course, they overturned it. But the reason why they overturned it is because they called the prison officials in Idaho uncompassionate. They just didn't understand the struggles this guy was going through, transitioning. That's the word they use. Transitioning from a man to a woman. And therefore, that somehow explains away his crime. Well, with this group of young people here, we finally came to the real source, the real reason that people commit murder. However it's redefined, the real reason for it is, you know it already, it's sin. It's a worldview conflict that infects the heart and the mind. Take your Bibles this morning, open with me to Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. I know it's an odd place to start when you're going to do a Genesis overview, but we're overviewing the overview here. Matthew chapter 15. I want you to listen to how Jesus unpacks that very question. Matthew chapter 15, beginning in verse 1 and 2. Here's what he said. Then some Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem, and they said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." Kind of an odd way to start out a conversation about murder, isn't it? But this is what Jesus does. Now they're upset. The scribes and Pharisees are upset that the disciples didn't follow tradition here. And Jesus goes on to basically tell the crowd, don't, these guys are acting hypocritically, don't act that same kind of way. Jump down to verse 11. I'll look at verse 10. Jesus called the crowd to him and he says to them, hear and understand. Now he's answering their question from verse 1 and 2. It is not what enters into the mouth that defiles the man, but what proceeds out of the mouth that defiles the man. Jump down to verse 17. Do you not understand that everything that goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is eliminated, but the things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart? Now you got to remember, he's talking about worldviews here. Presuppositions, assumptions. We said those words are basically interchangeable. The things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and those are the things that defile the man. And look how he lists this. Verse 19, for out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, slanders. These are the things which defile the man. But to eat with unwashed hands, that doesn't defile a man. So Jesus is exposing the faulty nature of the Pharisees' own worldview. All of these external manifestations of holiness that they hold so dear will not make them clean. It will not make anybody clean. A person's actions come from the heart. It's what they think, it's what they believe. And verse 11 is where the force of this comes from. If you think about a current debate in our society, the gun control debate, okay? I mean, reading about and hearing about these mass shootings is horrible. It is horrible. But there are those who advocate the Second Amendment. I'm one of those. And often we see these bumper stickers on cars. The bumper sticker will read something like, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Now, for the most part, I really agree with that. Because I agree that a person doesn't decide to kill someone because they have a gun or a sword or a knife or a cannon or an abortion scalpel. They gain these things when they decide to kill someone. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, I had a bike. And a bike that had these, you remember these banana seats, these long seats, okay? And then it had the brackets on the back that would connect to the back axle. Well, I had two older brothers, and they both watched out for me, and I always liked that. I appreciated them. But my middle brother, him and I had a little more conflict just because we were closer in age. But he was a protector of me. And he wanted to protect me one time because the one back bracket was starting to rust away and it was kind of breaking. But I didn't care. I was still riding my bike. He's going to fix it for me in order to protect me from hurting myself. And if I don't let him fix this to protect me from hurting myself, he's going to pound me. That's the way brothers just work things out. Well, of course, I didn't want him, so we start tussling around, and he pushes me down, or something will happen. What I do remember, I don't remember all those details, but I do remember clearly, I can picture this as clear right now as the day that it happened. I was so mad, I just looked around, and in the garage, my dad had this metal doll. It's about 1/4 inch in diameter. One of those things that it would just whip like this. So I picked it up, and I whapped him right in the back. And I remember, I can still envision this, he just went like this. He went, oh, like he couldn't breathe, like nothing could come out of his mouth. Well, I'm panicking. I didn't think I killed him, but I thought I broke something. I throw it down, I run in the house. Mom, Kent's really hurting out there. Right away, my mom goes, what happened? Have you guys been fighting again? No. Like I wasn't going to get caught, 5 minutes later, So she goes out, and he's still out there like, oh, and he can't talk. Kent, what's the matter? What's the matter? And I'm standing by the back door, and my mom, what did you do to him? I didn't do anything. I don't know what happened. It's my worldview at the moment. But I was thinking to myself, my brother and I, we laugh about this today. But I was thinking to myself, what if it wasn't the metal doll? Now, he had a big gash across his back from this, a welt. What if it was an axe? What if it was a hammer? I don't know what would have happened with this. See, what's happening here is Jesus is exposing the faulty nature of the Pharisees' worldview. All these external manifestations are not what makes a person clean. A worldview. This is what they have. They have presuppositions, and we talked about worldview. A worldview is the way in which a person views the nature of reality, how things work. All people have one. Presuppositions, assumptions. These are interchangeable terms in how we use them, and they dictate a person's thoughts, their life, their actions. Presuppositions will dictate questions like, does God exist or does he not exist? Presuppositions will dictate, am I a conservative, am I a liberal? And I don't mean just politically, but I mean in any part of life. It'll dictate answering questions like, is Jesus the fullness of God, or is God open to all other beliefs? That's a question that's being challenged by so-called evangelicals in the pulpit today. Presuppositions will direct whether you're a Browns fan or whether you're not a Browns fan. See, people act on presuppositions, however you have arrived at them. And of course, they certainly can change at different times in your life for different reasons. Becoming a Christian is meant to do just that. It's meant to change your presuppositions. It's meant to change the way you view the world. Paul, in Ephesians chapter 2, 10 great verses. You don't have to turn there, but 10 great verses there. He reminds those churches in Asia Minor, he says, you know, there was a time you used to walk like this. That's another way of just saying there's a time in which you had a worldview just like this. You walked according to the powers of this world, the forces of this world system, and it's God, Satan. But now, those two great words in Ephesians 2:5, but now, because of your faith in Christ, you walk differently. So what Jesus unfolds here is this tension between worldviews from a seemingly minor argument, which began from the Pharisees, as we saw in those first couple of verses. The disciples didn't wash their hands properly before eating according to tradition. It wasn't the law of Moses. It's not that it's a bad thing, but this is all it was to them. It was just a tradition. And you kind of got Jesus going, yeah, okay, so they didn't wash their hands, but Jesus knows something else, doesn't he? Jesus knows their heart, because clean hands is not their concern. Trapping Jesus is. They're wicked. They hate Jesus. They hate his followers. And they're looking for anything to take him down. So they see these guys eating corn. They didn't wash their hands. We can take Jesus down. See, these guys are religionists. They're law keepers. That's their worldview. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're a law keeper, if you're a keeper of the Mosaic law, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because what Jesus has been doing is he's been pointing people to the place that law keepers should go, because that's what the law was meant to do. The law was meant to point you to something else. The law wasn't meant for you to keep and then you just stop there and you say, oh, I can do that. 10 commandments. I could squeeze out maybe 5 or 6. I don't know about 10. Because Jesus is pointing them, saying, hey, look, the law was meant to point you to me. The law was meant to show you you're inadequate in gaining God's righteousness. That's the whole point. That's the beauty of the law, is to tell you you're really, really bad. But in Jesus, you can be really good. Heaven and earth are colliding over these worldviews. Look at it again. Pick it up in verse 14. Let me just read back through this again. He tells the crowd, let them alone, meaning the Pharisees. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind, and if a blind man guides a blind man, both are going to fall into a pit. Peter says to him, well, explain the parable to us. Now, haven't we seen this many times with the disciples, especially because Peter typically is a spokesman? Verse 16, Jesus says, are you still lacking in understanding? That's another way, a way for him to say, as he said in other times, you've been with me this long and you still don't get what I'm doing here? Verse 17, do you not understand that everything that goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is eliminated, but the things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart? Those are the things that defile the man, meaning stop worrying about whether or not you washed your hands. That's just a tradition. It doesn't matter if it violates the law. If it violates the law, it means that you're not a good law keeper and you need something else. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. Verse 19. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, slanders. These are the things which defile the man. But to eat with unwashed hands, that does not defile the man. See, what he does here is he brilliantly dissects their motives, which comes from their hearts, their minds. Dirty hands are not an indication of a dirty heart, of a dirty life. A dirty heart is an indication of a dirty life. Their hands are clean. Yeah, the Pharisees, their hands are clean. but not their souls. See, that's exactly why Satan excels in making sin look clean and acceptable and normal and safe. Because then we're less aware that it's happening. It's in the heart. Verse 19, it's in the heart where it all happens. This is where worldviews are made and corrupted. And once there, it will do everything to express itself in our actions. This is where murder comes from. This is where envy, strife, lying, hatred, bigotry, whatever. This is where it comes from. It begins in sin, molded into a worldview. Now, let's be clear about something. To commit an act of sin, to commit some act of evil, is not a worldview response. That's simply a sinful response. But how I respond to that act is a worldview response. If I make some attempt to explain it away, like I did. Oh yeah, I don't know what happened to my brother. Yeah, I don't know, Mom. I was just out riding my bike, and all of a sudden he just, doubled over backwards. I don't get it. Like I wasn't going to get caught. Really? That's a worldview response. If I try to explain it away, I try to blame it on my upbringing, I try to redefine it or try to hide it, that's a worldview response. It's also a worldview response if I admit that it's wrong. Yeah, I did it. I whacked my brother. I got mad at him and I whacked him one. That's a worldview response. If I accept the consequences, if I try to fix it, if I try to help others to avoid the same mistake, those are all a worldview at work. Okay. I think that's enough right now to give us kind of a working formula, and it may be, again, you may know all this. This may just be a review for you this morning. So what I want to do now is to take this and apply it to our topic at hand. Because our topic at hand is going to be a God-centered world, a God-centered universe, creation. Did God tell us his secrets for creating? When heaven and earth collide. Now, when you talk about heaven and earth colliding, there's two lines of thought which we're going to ask by way of questions this morning. We're going to look at one now, and then we'll look at another one here in a few moments. The first line of thought by way of a question is this: is a creationist worldview necessary? Is it necessary? I'm a Christian. The Bible presents itself as being revelational in all that it records, and it records a lot about origins. Is it right? Is it right? Even if it seems to come in conflict with some new modern scientific discovery. That's the first issue by way of a question. Here's the second one. Is a creationist worldview negotiable? First question is that, is a creationist worldview necessary? The second one, is a creationist worldview negotiable? Meaning that when the Bible's account of origins seems to conflict with some modern scientific theory, should it be the Bible that gets re-examined, reworded, or negotiated down? Or should we look at the theory and say, what's wrong with that? Now, I specifically use the term creationist to point to the biblical record because in answering, say, for example, that first question, we'll do this first, just for a moment here. That first question, is a creationist worldview necessary? The answer to that question is yes, it is. Yes, it is necessary. A creationist view is necessary because if it's true what Jesus said, what we just looked at in Matthew 15, if it's true that it's the heart which reveals men's actions, if that's true, if it's true where it talks in other places, like Proverbs 23, that what a man thinks in his heart, so is he. If that is all true, then the biblical creationist text tells us something spectacular, especially when you're looking at Genesis. The Bible brings to life an accurate description of where mankind came from. How we all started out and it does this all by way of a historical narrative form, and it gives some significant detail to all of this. It started out, we learn, the best that it possibly could be, and then something went wrong, and that was sin. And sin ruined everything. And then we ask questions like, well, can this be fixed? And the answer to that is yes, it can be. How? Exactly what we're celebrating here this morning, the cross. And this is where Genesis becomes so foundational for us. The events of Genesis, the fall from perfection, leads us to exactly what we're doing here this morning. If that fall from perfection isn't true, if it's reduced downward, then these elements lose their meaning. If the biblical creationist account is wrong, if it's negotiated down, then the Bible cannot say things in the way that Paul does. Let's say in 2 Corinthians chapter 15, you don't have to turn there. Just listen to the words. Here's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 15:22. He says, as in Adam all die, in Adam. What has he just done there? He's gone all the way back to the beginning. There's no beginning before the beginning. He's just gone back to the beginning, and he has said, as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all shall be made alive. That's what we're celebrating here this morning. Or as Paul says in Romans 5, verse 18, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so through one act of righteousness. What's he talking about there? He's talking about Adam and he's talking about Jesus. So through one act of righteousness there resulted justification of life to all men. Now can you imagine if we negotiated down or threw out the biblical creationist view, then those words uttered by Paul and other places in the New Testament, then what we do here this morning, these elements, represent something else altogether. They represent a false Messiah, a mystical Messiah, or merely just a symbolic one. And we're still left with a terrible problem of sin that destroys everything in its path. The cross, by necessity, leads back to a real, historical, accurate Genesis. And we learn that the problem, our problem of sin, is being fixed right here. It's only the real history of the fall which the cross can defeat. Anything else is pointless. Let's take a break here. Let's take some time and celebrate around the bread. Let's have our servers come. As always, we invite you, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, to partake in fellowship with us through the bread and through the cup, as we'll do here in a few moments. You don't have to be a member of Victory Baptist Church, but if you're a member of God's kingdom, you know Jesus as Savior, we invite you to be a part of us. Well, it's in Genesis where the true history of planet Earth and its inhabitants are found. This is where, as we said, worldviews are made and they are broken, all of them, all of them. If questions like God's existence, if God exists, if it's really true that he exists, it's in Genesis where this is going to be found. If it's true that God is the mover and shaker behind all things, it's in Genesis where this is going to be found out. And if we alter the words, if we do something with the meaning of the text, we change the context, the structure in any way, then what happens is we alter everything else that the Bible reveals. There are pastors in pulpits today. There's one very famous pastor who is talking about disengaging the Old Testament from the New Testament. How do you do that? How do you do that? You know, you talk about putting the cart before the horse. This is like getting rid of the horse or getting rid of the cart. You can't do that. Because everything that the Bible reveals builds from Genesis. It builds from God's perfection, man's rebellion, the world's destruction, God's redemption. God is the bookends. We see him in Genesis. In the beginning, God. We see him in Revelation. He started in perfection. He's going to end in perfection. But in between that, I hate to say it like this, but this is true. In between these bookends are ugly volumes of knowledge. It's called mankind, made up by tens of billions of us. So that second question, just to take a moment or two here to that second question, is a creationist worldview negotiable? The first question was, is a creationist worldview necessary? We said yes. The second question, is a creationist worldview negotiable? The answer to this one is no. Not if you want to maintain the integrity of the text, of the narrative itself. But we have no doubt that conflicting worldviews collide often in a fallen world. Romans 8, if you want to open there, I'm going to turn quickly to Romans 8, verse 5. Romans 8, verse 5 says it like this. Those who are according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who are according to the Spirit, they set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Now that's an incredible description there. And what this means is that when you think about uncovering a fact in this world, or let's just say somebody makes an observation about something, it is our worldviews, it is our presuppositions which take us to our conclusions. Let's just use as an example, because this example will come up a lot in the months ahead. Let's just say we come across a fossil. That's a big deal when you're talking about creation. So whether you are a theist or an atheist, you're someone who's a Christian and you believe the Bible, you're someone who is not. When you find a fossil in the ground, it's a fact. The fossil is a fact. It's really there. Both of you are looking at the same thing. Whatever shape it's in, wherever you find it, you're both looking at the same thing. But it's your conclusions that you draw on these things. And then you ask the question, if I discover a fact, if I make an observation about something, I have to ask, well, what do these facts mean? How are these facts interpreted? How are they applied? If that leads the mind of the unsaved or the fleshly person, as Paul refers to it here, if that leads them to a conclusion that differs with the Bible, it's not the Bible that needs altering, it's our conclusions. And the reason is, here's what Paul's saying. He goes on, verse 6 and 7. He says, for the mind set on the flesh is death, but the mind set on the Spirit is life and peace, because the mind set on the flesh is hostile towards God, for it does not subject itself to the law of God, for it is not even able to do so. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Now that doesn't mean, Paul's not saying when it's hostile to God, it doesn't mean that everybody is an antagonist and they hate God, as it were. It just means that their conclusions will not be God-centered, at least where their conclusions might conflict with some of their own personal desires in life. And when that happens, it becomes our worldview that then decides for us what an observation or a fact might mean. If God exists, again, we're back to this, we ask a hypothetical question. If God exists, if he really is the embodiment of all truth, then all facts and all observations and all inquiry will uncover that, since he is the author of everything that exists. And even in that statement, an atheist would agree with that. An atheist would agree, if God does exist, if he really did create everything, then certainly everything that would be found in this world would point to him, since he's a creator of all things. It's just that the atheist says he doesn't exist. But it's in Genesis where God first and foundationally tells us how everything came to be, and how everything transpired, and how everything is right now. And if we fudge with that and try to make it say something else, something other, to satisfy this fleshly mind of ours, then we end up with no real solutions to anything, only further re-explanations and hopeless conclusions. Or the killing of puppies. Remember we mentioned this last week? We end up with hopeless conclusions where the killing of puppies is seen as more heinous than the killing of unborn babies. Or where the God-ordained union of man and woman and the whole issue of sexuality is now recalculated to include whatever we deem right at the moment. Guy in prison wants a sex change operation. Well, some court will come along and say, yeah, certainly, how uncompassionate can you possibly be? If God is the author of this world and all in existence, which is what the biblical creationist worldview holds to, biblically, then he knows how everything works best. See, even an atheist would agree with that. Yes, if God did bring everything into being, if he's the creator, of course the creator of something knows how things work best. Yes, that would be true. But the fleshly mind says he just doesn't exist. But if he does, he knows how it works. And he knows that things that are broken can be redeemed and made new again. And for us, it begins with exactly what we are doing here at this table. We are broken by sin. And if God is true, then it is this cup, his blood, what it represents to us, we trust by faith to keep us firmly planted. With that in mind, let's have our servers come forward again. Let's partake of the cup.